Let me craft part one of the story in a natural, engaging way that captures the human elements while maintaining appropriate content standards. The late afternoon sun streamed through the airport terminal windows as Andrea Thompson made her way to Gate B-17. Her smart business suit was slightly wrinkled after a week of intense court proceedings, and dark circles lingered under her eyes despite her best efforts with concealer. As a corporate lawyer who just won a major case for her client, she should have been celebrating. Instead, all she wanted was to get home to Chicago and spend the weekend catching up on sleep. Rolling her carry-on suitcase behind her, she joined the boarding line, double-checking her phone to confirm she was in the right group. The gate agent smiled warmly, scanning her boarding pass and complimenting her blazer. Andrea managed a tired smile in return, grateful for the small kindness after an exhausting week. The plane was already crowded when she made her way down the narrow aisle to seat 23C. Passengers shuffled about, storing bags and settling in for the 3-hour flight. Andrea spotted her row and began the familiar dance of lifting her regulation-sized carry-on into the overhead compartment. That's when she heard it, a sharp, cutting voice from behind her. "Excuse me, but you're doing that completely wrong." Flight attendant Marie Walsh stood with her arms crossed, her lips pressed into a thin line. Despite Andrea's careful movements, Marie's tone suggested she was watching someone try to shove an elephant into a matchbox. "I'm sorry." Andrea paused, her bag partially lifted. Other passengers glanced over, some already sensing the tension building in the cramped space. "Your bag," Marie continued, her voice growing louder. "It's clearly too large for our overhead compartments. You'll need to check it." Andrea blinked, momentarily confused. She'd flown this same route dozens of times with this exact bag. Just minutes ago, the gate agent had approved it without question. She noticed Marie stepping past other passengers with similar-sized luggage, making no comments about their bags. "I understand your concern," Andrea said carefully, maintaining her professional courtroom composure despite her exhaustion. "But this is the standard carry-on size. I fly this route regularly, and—" Marie cut her off with a dismissive wave. "I don't care how often you fly. I'm telling you it won't fit, and you're holding up the boarding process." Her voice carried down the aisle, drawing more attention. A few passengers shifted uncomfortably in their seats, while others pretended to be absorbed in their phones. Andrea's hands trembled slightly as she continued to maneuver the bag, acutely aware of the growing audience. Years of handling hostile witnesses in court had taught her to stay calm under pressure. But something about this confrontation felt different. More personal, more pointed. She could feel her heart racing, but kept her voice steady and low. Just as she was about to respond, an older passenger a few rows ahead dropped her reading glasses while struggling with her own carry-on. They clattered to the floor, sliding under a seat. Marie didn't even glance in that direction, her attention fixed solely on Andrea's bag with an intensity that seemed far beyond normal concern for proper luggage storage. The tension in the cabin was palpable now. A young man across the aisle had quietly taken out his phone, angling it to record the interaction. Two businesswomen exchanged knowing looks, their expressions a mix of sympathy and recognition. They'd seen this before, the unprovoked escalation, the selective enforcement, the unmistakable undercurrent of bias. Andrea took a deep breath, her legal training kicking in. She knew this moment called for more than just defending her right to store her bag. It was about handling the situation in a way that might prevent it from happening to someone else in the future. With her heart still pounding, but her mind clear, she reached for her phone, ready to transform this confrontation into something constructive. The story was just beginning, but already the other passengers could sense they were about to witness something unexpected. A masterclass in turning conflict into change. The tension in the airplane cabin grew thicker as Andrea calmly pulled out her phone. Several passengers leaned forward in their seats, expecting another viral airplane confrontation video. But what happened next caught everyone by surprise. I completely understand your concern about proper bag storage, Andrea said, her voice clear but gentle. She opened her photo gallery and turned the screen toward Marie. I took these pictures at the gate check just 10 minutes ago. Here's my bag next to the measurement stand, and as you can see, it fits perfectly within the airline's size requirements. Marie's face tightened, but before she could respond, Andrea continued, and here's something interesting. I actually learned the correct way to place bags in these bins during a flight last month. Another flight attendant showed me this technique. She demonstrated by turning her bag at a specific angle, allowing it to slide smoothly into place while leaving room for other luggage. Around them, the atmosphere shifted. A businessman in a wrinkled suit nodded approvingly. A college student who'd been filming the interaction slowly lowered his phone, realizing this wasn't going to be the kind of confrontational content he expected. But Marie wasn't ready to back down. Her voice rose sharply, drawing even more attention. Are you trying to tell me how to do my job? I've been a flight attendant for 8 years. I could have you removed from this flight for being uncooperative. Several phones came back up, recording again. A mother covering her young daughter's ears shook her head disapprovingly at Marie's outburst. 2 rows back, a retired teacher whispered to her seatmate, "That poor woman didn't do anything wrong." Andrea noticed the elderly passenger still struggling with her fallen glasses and heavy bag. Without missing a beat, she stepped away from her own confrontation. "Excuse me," she said politely to Marie, "but I see someone who needs help." Walking past the stunned flight attendant, Andrea moved to help the older woman. "Let me get those glasses for you," she offered, kneeling down to retrieve them from under the seat. "And may I help you with your bag? I just learned a great trick for fitting them in these bins." The elderly passenger, grateful for the assistance, smiled warmly. "Oh, thank you, dear. These old hands aren't as steady as they used to be." Andrea efficiently stored both bags, explaining the technique to nearby passengers who listened with interest. "See, if you angle it this way first, then turn it, there's actually more space than you might think. The key is working with the bin's design, not against it." Other passengers began trying her method, finding their own bags fitting more easily. Soon, several people were helping each other, creating an unexpected moment of community at 30,000 feet. The cabin buzzed with quiet conversation and thank yous. Marie stood frozen in the aisle, watching as the passenger she tried to intimidate transformed the entire atmosphere of the plane. Her earlier aggressive stance began to waver as she saw other crew members exchange glances. The contrast between her behavior and Andrea's was impossible to ignore. A young flight attendant from first class, drawn by the commotion, appeared at Marie's side. She took in the scene, passengers working together, Andrea helping others, and Marie's increasingly uncomfortable expression. With a subtle nod to her colleague, she stepped forward to assess the situation. The young attendant noticed something else too. The way several passengers were protectively watching Andrea, phones still recording, ready to speak up if needed. Among them was an off-duty pilot who had witnessed the entire interaction. He caught the young attendant's eye and gave a slight head shake, silently communicating his view of the situation. What had started as an attempt to humiliate one passenger had unexpectedly turned into a powerful demonstration of grace under pressure. As Andrea returned to her seat, having helped several more passengers with their bags, the atmosphere in the cabin had completely transformed. But this was just the beginning of how she would turn this confrontation into an opportunity for real change. The story was building toward a moment that would challenge not just one flight attendant's behavior, but an entire system's approach to customer service and equal treatment. The young flight attendant, Amy, stepped forward with a calm, professional demeanor that sharply contrasted with Marie's earlier hostility. "Is everything all right here?" she asked, looking between Andrea and Marie. Her presence seemed to deflate some of the tension in the cabin, like opening a window in a stuffy room. Andrea showed Amy the same photos on her phone, her voice steady despite the lingering adrenaline from the confrontation. As she scrolled through the images, other passengers began speaking up, their voices overlapping with their own accounts of what they'd witnessed. "I was right here when it started," said a woman in a navy business suit. "The bag meets all requirements. I have the exact same one." She held up her own carry-on for comparison. A gray-haired man in seat 24D leaned forward. "I've got it all on video," he offered quietly. The way she was singled out wasn't right. "I've been watching other passengers board with larger bags, and nothing was said to them." The elderly woman Andrea had helped chimed in, her voice carrying surprising authority despite her fragile appearance. "This lovely young lady helped several of us, while that other attendant was—" She paused diplomatically, being less than helpful. Amy listened carefully, her expression professional but concerned. She noticed how the other passengers had formed a sort of protective circle around Andrea, not with angry confrontation, but with quiet solidarity. The off-duty pilot, who had been observing everything, caught her eye and gave a subtle nod. "I watched the whole thing," he said, standing up. "In my 20 years of flying, I've never seen a passenger handle this kind of situation with more grace." She turned what could have been an ugly confrontation into a lesson in courtesy and efficiency. Marie shifted uncomfortably, her earlier confidence crumbling as more passengers shared their observations. The phones recording the incident now captured her defensive posture, a stark contrast to her previous aggressive stance. Andrea took this moment to speak up, but not to complain. Instead, she pulled out her business card and handed it to Amy. "I work in corporate law," she explained, "and I've helped several companies improve their training programs. This situation today, it's an opportunity, not for punishment, but for positive change." The other passengers listened intently as she continued, "Every interaction on this plane affects dozens of people. Today showed how quickly things can go wrong, but also how they can be turned around. Maybe there's a way to use this experience to help other flight crews handle similar situations better." Amy's eyes lit up with understanding. She'd been through countless training sessions, but none had captured the real-world complexity of situations like this. She glanced at Marie, who now stood quietly at the back of the cabin, then back to Andrea. "Would you be willing to write up your suggestions?" Amy asked. "I think our training department would be very interested in your perspective, especially given your professional background." A young woman who had been quietly observing spoke up from her window seat. "I work in HR for another airline," she offered. "This kind of real-world example, it's exactly what we need in our diversity and customer service training programs." The atmosphere in the cabin had completely transformed. What had started as an ugly confrontation was evolving into a constructive dialogue about systemic improvement. Passengers who had been strangers minutes ago were now engaged in thoughtful discussion about how to prevent similar incidents in the future. Andrea noticed something else too. Marie had disappeared to another section of the plane, replaced by Amy, who was now helping the remaining passengers store their bags using the technique Andrea had demonstrated. The small acts of kindness and assistance continued to ripple through the cabin. But as the plane prepared for takeoff, Andrea knew this story wasn't over. The real work, turning this incident into meaningful change, was just beginning. She pulled out her laptop, opened a new document, and began typing while the details were still fresh in her mind. This wasn't just about one flight anymore. It was about making air travel better for everyone. As the plane reached cruising altitude, Andrea's fingers moved swiftly across her laptop keyboard. The cabin lights dimmed for those who wanted to rest, but her screen cast a soft glow as she documented every detail of the incident while it was fresh in her mind. She wasn't writing a complaint. She was crafting a proposal for change. A flight attendant, not Marie or Amy, came by with a beverage cart. She smiled warmly at Andrea, having been briefed about the earlier situation. "Would you like something to drink?" she asked, her kindness genuine. Andrea accepted a cup of tea, grateful for the normalcy of the simple interaction. The off-duty pilot, who had witnessed everything, walked past on his way to the restroom and paused at her row. "I hope you don't mind," he said quietly, "but I've already sent a message to our chief of operations about what happened. The way you handled that situation, it was remarkable." Andrea thanked him, then returned to her work. On her screen, she outlined practical suggestions: real-world scenario training, role-playing exercises, cultural sensitivity workshops. Her legal background helped her frame everything constructively, focusing on solutions rather than problems. A light tap on her shoulder interrupted her typing. It was the HR professional from the other airline, who had moved to a closer seat during the drink service. "I couldn't help noticing what you're writing," she said. "Would you mind if I shared some insights from our airline's experiences?" For the next 30 minutes, they had a quiet but intense discussion about industry-wide challenges and potential solutions. Other passengers nearby listened in, occasionally offering their own perspectives as frequent flyers. What had started as one person's documentation was evolving into a collaborative effort to improve air travel for everyone. Amy passed by occasionally, noting how the conversation was developing. During one pass, she discreetly mentioned that Marie had requested to speak with Andrea when things calmed down. "She's been in the back galley, thinking about everything," Amy explained. "I think she wants to make things right." The elderly woman Andrea had helped earlier dozed peacefully nearby, her glasses now safely stored in their case. Her presence served as a quiet reminder of how simple acts of kindness could change the entire atmosphere of a situation. As the plane crossed over state lines, Andrea's document grew into something more comprehensive than she'd initially planned. It wasn't just about one incident anymore. It had become a blueprint for better airline customer service, incorporating perspectives from both employees and passengers. A young student who'd been quietly observing everything finally spoke up. "You know," she said thoughtfully, "I'm studying business management, and what you're doing right now, this is exactly what we learn about turning negative experiences into positive institutional change." The businessman who had nodded approvingly earlier leaned forward. "I travel weekly for work," he shared. "If every airline adopted even half of what you're proposing, it would transform the whole flying experience." As Andrea continued writing, she noticed something remarkable happening around her. Passengers who would normally be sleeping or watching movies were engaged in quiet, constructive conversations about their own travel experiences. The cabin had become a kind of impromptu focus group for improving airline service. Amy returned with a fresh cup of tea for Andrea, unprompted. "The chief purser would like to speak with you before we land," she said softly. "She's already read some of the pilot's report, and she thinks your insights could be valuable for our training department." Looking around the cabin, Andrea realized that what had started as an ugly confrontation had transformed into something unexpectedly positive. The very people who had witnessed her humiliation were now part of a larger conversation about making air travel better for everyone. But the most challenging part of her journey was still to come: the upcoming conversation with Marie. Sometimes, Andrea knew from her legal experience, the hardest conversations were also the most important ones for creating real change. The plane had settled into its cruising rhythm when Amy approached Andrea again. "Marie would like to speak with you in the back galley," she said softly. "Are you comfortable with that?" Andrea nodded, saving her document before standing up. The walk to the back of the plane felt longer than usual. Passengers who had witnessed the earlier confrontation watched carefully, some offering encouraging smiles. The elderly woman she'd helped gave her hand a gentle squeeze as she passed. In the galley, Marie stood with her hands clasped, looking very different from the confrontational figure of 2 hours ago. Her shoulders were slightly hunched, and her earlier aggressive confidence had been replaced by genuine discomfort. "I've been thinking," Marie began, her voice barely above a whisper. "I've been doing this job for 8 years, and I've never—" She paused, searching for words. "I thought I was just doing my job, enforcing the rules. But watching how you handled everything, how you helped other passengers instead of arguing with me, it made me realize something." Andrea listened quietly, noticing how Marie's hands trembled slightly as she spoke. This wasn't the same person who had tried to humiliate her earlier. This was someone coming to terms with their own actions. The thing is, Marie continued, we get so much training about rules and procedures, but sometimes we forget about the people. When I saw you helping that elderly passenger, showing others how to store their bags, she shook her head. I was doing everything wrong, wasn't I? A light turbulence shook the plane, making the coffee pots rattle in their holders. Both women steadied themselves against the galley wall, the shared moment breaking some of the tension. We all have bad days, Andrea said gently. What matters is what we learn from them. She pulled out her phone and showed Marie some of the suggestions she'd been writing. I've been working on ideas that might help prevent situations like this. Would you be willing to look at them? Your experience could add valuable perspective. Marie's eyes widened as she read through the notes. These are really good, she said, sounding surprised. Especially this part about scenario training. We usually just get lectures about policies, but acting out real situations might help us handle things better. Their conversation was interrupted by Amy bringing back empty drink cups. She smiled seeing them talking constructively, and added her own thoughts about training improvements. Soon, all three women were engaged in a detailed discussion of practical ways to enhance flight crew training. You know what the hardest part is? Marie admitted. Sometimes we get so caught up in the rules that we forget to see the person in front of us. When you helped that elderly passenger, you weren't just solving a problem, you were showing kindness. The chief purser joined them, having heard about the situation. Instead of a disciplinary conversation, she found three women actively discussing ways to improve airline service. She listened intently as Andrea shared her ideas about incorporating real-world scenarios into training. What strikes me most, the chief purser said, is how this situation could have gone so differently. Instead of a viral video of another airline confrontation, we're having a meaningful discussion about improvement. As they talked, other crew members drifted in and out of the galley, each adding their own experiences and insights. What had started as a tense confrontation was transforming into a collaborative effort to make flying better for everyone. Andrea noticed something else too. Marie's whole demeanor had changed. The defensive hostility was gone, replaced by genuine engagement. She was actively taking notes, adding her own suggestions based on years of experience. The conversation wrapped up as the pilot announced they'd be starting their descent soon. As Andrea turned to head back to her seat, Marie touched her arm lightly. Thank you, she said quietly. Not just for forgiving me, but for showing me a better way to do my job. Walking back to her seat, Andrea realized that sometimes the most powerful changes don't come from confrontation, but from finding common ground and working together for better solutions. As the plane began its descent into Chicago, the cabin crew prepared for landing. Andrea returned to her seat, where several passengers leaned in curiously, wanting to know how the conversation with Marie had gone. The elderly woman she'd helped earlier was fully awake now, her kind eyes full of concern. You won't believe what just happened, Andrea said softly to those around her. She explained how the confrontational situation had transformed into a productive discussion about airline training and customer service. The HR professional from the other airline listened intently, jotting down notes on her phone. The off-duty pilot, who had been keeping a watchful eye on the situation, smiled approvingly. You know, he said, in all my years of flying, I've seen hundreds of conflicts. But I've never seen one resolve quite like this. Usually, these things end up on social media with everyone angry. A young mother across the aisle, who had been quietly observing everything while caring for her sleeping toddler, spoke up. I travel a lot with my little one, she said, gently stroking her child's hair. If more people handled conflicts the way you did today, flying would be so much less stressful for everyone. The plane hit a patch of turbulence, causing the cabin to shake slightly. As everyone gripped their armrests, Andrea noticed how the shared experience had created a sense of community among the passengers. People who would normally be strangers were now engaged in meaningful conversation about making air travel better. Amy passed through the cabin one last time, checking seatbelts. She paused at Andrea's row. "The chief purser wants you to know that she's already sent an email to our training department. They're very interested in your suggestions." She lowered her voice. "And Marie? Well, I've never seen her like this. She's actually taking notes about better ways to handle situations." The businessman who had been following the events since the beginning chuckled. "You turned what could have been a disaster into a teaching moment," he said. "That's pretty impressive." As the plane descended through the clouds, Andrea opened her laptop one last time. She added a few final thoughts to her document, incorporating insights from her conversation with Marie. The HR professional next to her peeked at the screen. "You know," she whispered, "if you're willing, I'd love to share some of these ideas with my airline's training team. We could really use this kind of real-world perspective." The plane touched down smoothly, and as passengers prepared to disembark, something unusual happened. Instead of the usual rush to stand and grab bags, people remained seated, allowing the elderly woman to gather her belongings first. One by one, passengers helped each other, passing bags and offering assistance. Marie appeared at the front of the cabin, looking nervous but determined. As passengers began to exit, she made eye contact with Andrea and gave a small nod. The transformation from their first encounter was remarkable. The chief purser approached Andrea as she gathered her things. "We'd like to stay in touch about implementing some of your suggestions," she said, handing over her business card. "What happened today? It could help change how we approach customer service training." As Andrea finally stepped off the plane, several passengers waited to thank her. The young student who had watched everything unfold shared how the experience had taught her more about conflict resolution than any classroom lecture. Walking through the terminal, Andrea reflected on how differently the day had turned out from what she'd expected. What could have been just another viral video of airline conflict had instead become a catalyst for positive change. Her phone buzzed, an email from the airline's training department already scheduling a follow-up meeting. Another message popped up from the HR professional she'd met, asking to connect about sharing training resources between airlines. As she headed toward baggage claim, Andrea smiled, thinking about how sometimes the most difficult moments can lead to unexpected opportunities for growth and change. The story wasn't over. In many ways, it was just beginning. 2 weeks after the flight, Andrea sat in a bright conference room at the airline's headquarters. Around the table sat airline executives, training coordinators, and surprisingly, both Amy and Marie. The wall-mounted screen displayed her presentation titled "Turning Moments into Movement, Improving Airline Customer Service." "What happened on that flight could have gone viral for all the wrong reasons," Andrea began, her voice calm but passionate. Instead, it became an opportunity for change. She clicked to the next slide, showing a simple diagram of how small conflicts could escalate or be transformed. Marie, who had requested to be part of this meeting, spoke up. "I've been doing this job for years," she admitted to the room. "But that day showed me how much I still had to learn about truly serving our passengers." Her honesty impressed the executives, who exchanged approving glances. The HR director leaned forward, interested. "What strikes me most is how this situation created a ripple effect. We've had other airlines reaching out, wanting to know more about the training changes we're considering." A video played on the screen, clips from passengers who had been on the flight, sharing their perspectives. The elderly woman appeared, describing how one person's kindness had transformed the entire atmosphere of the plane. The off-duty pilot spoke about witnessing professional growth in real time. "The best part," Amy added, "is how this has already changed things. Last week, I had a similar situation with an oversized bag. Instead of escalating, I remembered what I learned from watching Andrea. The passenger and I actually worked together to find a solution." The training coordinator stood up, pointing to new materials spread across the table. We've incorporated your suggestions into our revised training program. Role-playing exercises, real-world scenarios, cultural sensitivity workshops, it's all here. A knock at the door interrupted them. A young flight attendant trainee poked her head in. Sorry to interrupt, but the CEO wanted to join if possible. The room quickly made space for the airline's chief executive, who had heard about the initiative. I've been following this closely, the CEO said, taking a seat. What impresses me most is how this wasn't just about handling one incident. It's about changing our entire approach to customer service. Andrea shared more specifics from her proposal. The room buzzed with energy as people contributed ideas, building on her foundation. Marie, who had been quiet, suddenly spoke up again. You know what really changed for me? She said, looking around the room. I realized we're not just enforcing rules, we're helping people have better journeys. Sometimes that means being flexible, being kind, finding creative solutions. The CEO nodded approvingly. This is exactly the culture shift we need. Not just for our airline, but for the industry as a whole. He turned to Andrea. Would you consider being part of our ongoing training advisory board? As the meeting continued, more ideas flowed. The training coordinator described new scenarios they developed, based on real situations like the one Andrea had handled. Amy shared how other flight attendants were already adopting the new approaches. The most powerful thing, Andrea concluded, is that this isn't just about avoiding bad situations. It's about creating good ones. Every interaction is an opportunity to make someone's journey better. As the meeting wrapped up, Marie approached Andrea quietly. I never thought my mistake would lead to something this big, she said. Thank you for showing me a better way. Walking out of the headquarters building, Andrea felt a sense of accomplishment. Her phone buzzed with messages from other airlines wanting to learn more about the training program. What had started as a difficult moment on one flight was growing into something much larger. A movement toward better, more humane air travel for everyone. But even as she headed home, Andrea knew this wasn't the end of the story. Real change takes time, commitment, and continuous effort. The next chapter was just beginning. 6 months later, Andrea walked through the same airport where her story had begun. This time, she wasn't just another passenger. She was there to witness the graduation of the first class of flight attendants trained under the new program she had helped develop. The training center buzzed with excitement as family members gathered to watch their loved ones receive their wings. Andrea spotted familiar faces in the crowd. Amy, who had been promoted to lead trainer, and Marie, who had become one of the most passionate advocates for the new approach to customer service. You won't believe the numbers, the airline's customer service director told Andrea as they watched the ceremony preparations. Passenger complaints are down 40%. Staff satisfaction is up. Other airlines are asking to send their trainers to learn our methods. A young graduate approached Andrea, her new wings gleaming on her uniform. We studied your case in training, she said excitedly. It changed how I think about this job. It's not just about rules, it's about connecting with people. The elderly woman from the original flight had been invited as a special guest. She sat in the front row, beaming proudly. I tell everyone about what happened that day, she said when Andrea came to greet her. How one person's kindness changed everything. During the ceremony, the airline's CEO made a surprising announcement. Today, we're not just celebrating new flight attendants. We're launching an industry-wide initiative for better customer service training, and it all started with one passenger who showed us a better way. Andrea noticed Marie wiping away tears during the speech. Later, Marie explained, Yesterday, I had a situation almost exactly like the one with you. But this time, I handled it completely differently. The passenger actually hugged me afterward. The HR professional from the other airline was there too, now heading up a joint training program between multiple carriers. Your story became a case study in how to transform conflict into opportunity, she told Andrea. It's being taught in business schools now. After the ceremony, A group of new graduates gathered around Andrea, eager to share their training experiences. One of them pulled out the manual they'd studied. Andrea's incident had been turned into a detailed lesson plan, complete with role-playing scenarios. The best part, Amy said, joining the group, is watching how this spreads. Every passenger who experiences good service tells others. Every flight attendant who handles a situation well teaches their colleagues. It's like dropping a stone in a pond. The ripples keep growing. The airline had set up a small exhibition showing the program's impact. Photos and testimonials lined the walls, sharing stories of how the new training had changed both passenger and staff experiences. Andrea's original document, now framed, hung in the center. As the celebration wound down, the CEO pulled Andrea aside. "Remember how this started? One difficult moment that could have gone viral for all the wrong reasons. Instead, it's transformed our entire industry's approach to customer service." Walking through the terminal later, Andrea passed a flight crew handling a tense situation with a frustrated passenger. She smiled as she watched them use the exact techniques that had emerged from her experience: staying calm, finding solutions, treating everyone with dignity. Her phone buzzed. Another airline wanting to implement the training program. As she headed to her gate, Andrea reflected on how one moment of choosing kindness over confrontation had sparked a movement larger than she could have imagined. The story had come full circle, but its impact continued to grow. In airports across the country, a new generation of flight attendants was learning that the most powerful tool in their uniform wasn't a rulebook. It was the ability to transform difficult moments into opportunities for human connection. And somewhere high above the clouds, passengers on countless flights were experiencing the difference that one person's choice to respond to hostility with kindness could make. The ripples of change continued to spread, one flight at a time.